Alexander the Great, a name that echoes through more than 2 millennia of history. But before he became the conqueror of Persia, the pharaoh of Egypt, and the ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to India, he was a boy. A boy born in a palace in Pella, in the northern kingdom of Macedon, in 356 BCE. This is where our story begins. Alexander was born into power, but also into tension. His father, King Philip II, was a formidable warrior and brilliant strategist who had transformed Macedon from a weak kingdom into a rising military power. His mother, Olympias, was a proud and fiery princess from Epirus, deeply religious and said to be descended from the hero Achilles. From Olympias, Alexander inherited a burning sense of destiny. From Philip, he inherited ambition and the art of war. Even at birth, legends surrounded Alexander. One tale tells that on the very night he was born, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, the largest temple of the ancient world, was burned to the ground. The priests declared that it was because Artemis herself was absent, attending the birth of a child who would one day shake the world. Olympias raised her son with stories of heroes and gods. She claimed that Alexander was descended not only from Achilles, but also from Heracles, the mighty son of Zeus. These myths fueled the boy's imagination. He grew up believing he was destined for greatness, perhaps even divinity. But Alexander was not merely raised on myths. His father ensured that he was trained in all the skills of a Macedonian prince. He was taught hunting, riding, combat, and leadership from an early age. One story, often retold by historians, captures his spirit. When he was still a boy, a magnificent horse was brought to Philip, but none of his men could tame it. The horse, named Bucephalus, was wild and uncontrollable. While others gave up, Alexander studied the animal carefully. He noticed that the horse was frightened of its own shadow. Turning Bucephalus toward the sun so the shadow fell behind, Alexander calmed him and mounted him. The crowd erupted in astonishment, and Philip, deeply moved, told his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom large enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." This moment became legendary, a symbol of Alexander's insight, courage, and unshakable confidence. Bucephalus would go on to carry him through countless battles and would become nearly as famous as the king himself. But perhaps the most important influence on Alexander's mind was not his parents, but his teacher. At the age of 13, Philip hired the greatest philosopher of the age, Aristotle. For 3 years, Alexander studied under the man who had studied under Plato, who himself had studied under Socrates. Aristotle taught him philosophy, ethics, science, medicine, politics, and above all, the love of Greek culture. He instilled in Alexander a fascination with knowledge, a habit of inquiry, and a belief in the superiority of Greek civilization. Yet Alexander was no passive student. He absorbed Aristotle's lessons, but he also developed his own views. While Aristotle believed in the separation of Greeks and barbarians, Alexander dreamed of unity. He would later blend Greek and Eastern cultures, an idea far ahead of his time. Still, the bond between teacher and student remained. Alexander even carried a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, on his campaigns. He saw Achilles as his role model and sought to live a life worthy of the epic heroes. His early life was also shaped by politics. As a young prince, he witnessed court intrigues, shifting alliances, and constant wars. Philip was expanding Macedon's influence across Greece, but he made many enemies. Alexander learned to navigate danger, suspicion, and betrayal. He also learned the harsh realities of power. His relationship with his father was complicated, marked by admiration, rivalry, and at times, bitterness. Philip often took other wives and mistresses, straining his marriage with Olympias and leaving Alexander uncertain about his position as heir. Despite these challenges, Alexander's brilliance shone early. At the age of 16, when Philip was away on campaign, he left Alexander in charge of the kingdom. The young prince crushed a local rebellion, established a city, and named it Alexandropolis, his first mark on the map. He was still a teenager, but already a leader of men. By the age of 18, he fought at his father's side in the Battle of Chaeronea, where Macedon defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. In that battle, Alexander led the companion cavalry and was said to have struck down the elite sacred band of Thebes. His courage and tactical skill impressed everyone, showing that he was ready for command. The boy was becoming the man. A man destined to inherit not just a kingdom, but his father's dream, the conquest of Persia. As we leave Alexander's childhood, we see the outlines of a legend in the making. A boy who believed he was descended from gods, a youth who tamed the untamable horse, a student of the greatest philosopher of Greece, a prince who led armies before he came of age. All of these threads wove together to create the figure who would become Alexander the Great. But the true test of his greatness had not yet begun. That would come with the death of his father, and the sudden, dangerous rise of a 20-year-old king facing a world filled with enemies. The year was 336 BCE. Macedon stood at the height of its power. King Philip II had created a professional army, united the fractious Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership, and prepared to launch an invasion of the Persian Empire. Victory seemed within his grasp, but fate intervened. At a grand celebration in Egypt, Philip was assassinated. He was stabbed by one of his own bodyguards during the wedding of his daughter. Chaos erupted, questions swirled. Was it a personal act of vengeance, a political conspiracy, or perhaps the hand of Olympias, Alexander's own mother? Historians still debate the truth. What is certain is that Philip's sudden death left a dangerous vacuum. Enemies circled. Rivals doubted whether a 20-year-old prince could hold the throne. Some Greek states whispered rebellion. Foreign powers, including Persia, watched closely, hoping to exploit the turmoil. Into this storm stepped Alexander, barely out of his teens. He now wore the crown of Macedon. His position was precarious, but his response was swift and ruthless. First, he eliminated rivals at court, consolidating his authority. Some suspected his mother played a bloody role in this, ensuring no competitor could challenge her son. Then, he moved against rebellion. The city of Thebes rose in defiance, believing Macedon weak after Philip's death. But Alexander marched with astonishing speed, covering hundreds of kilometers in mere days. He surrounded Thebes, stormed its walls, and crushed its resistance. The city was destroyed, its people enslaved or killed, and its territory handed to neighboring allies. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. This act sent shockwaves across Greece. Athens, Sparta, and others quickly submitted. The message was clear. Alexander was no weak boy king. He was a force of nature, a leader to be feared and obeyed. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned to his father's unfinished dream, the conquest of Persia. In the spring of 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with an army of some 40,000 men. For many, this was an audacious gamble. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching from Asia Minor to Egypt and beyond to India. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Alexander's force was small in comparison, but he possessed qualities the Persians lacked: speed, discipline, innovative tactics, and above all, his own unbreakable will. Before stepping onto Asian soil, Alexander performed a symbolic act. He visited the legendary site of Troy, where the Greeks of old had fought their mythical war. There, he sacrificed to Athena and honored the tomb of Achilles, his heroic ancestor. He ran naked around the tomb, as was the custom, and declared Achilles his role model. His friend Hephaestion honored Patroclus, Achilles' companion. In this act, Alexander proclaimed himself not just a warrior, but a new Achilles, destined to surpass the heroes of old. Soon after, the young king faced his first major test, the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, or governors, assembled an army to block his advance. Alexander, against the advice of some of his generals, charged across the river and attacked. Leading from the front, as always, he was nearly killed when a Persian noble raised his sword to strike him down. At the last moment, one of his companions intervened, saving his life. The Macedonians won a decisive victory, opening Asia Minor to Alexander's campaign. After Granicus, many Greek cities under Persian control welcomed him as a liberator. Some, however, resisted, and Alexander dealt with them harshly. He was both conqueror and propagandist, presenting himself as the champion of Greek freedom against Persian tyranny. Yet Alexander's ambitions reached far beyond. He was not content with small victories. He sought the destruction of the Persian king, Darius III, and the capture of the entire empire. In 333 BCE, the two sides met again at the Battle of Issus, in the narrow coastal plains of southern Anatolia. This time, Darius himself commanded a massive army, far outnumbering the Macedonians. At the height of the battle, Alexander led a furious charge directly at Darius. The Persian king, overwhelmed, fled the battlefield, abandoning his mother, wife, and children to capture. It was a humiliating defeat for Persia and a spectacular triumph for Alexander. With Darius in retreat, the path to the rich lands of the Levant and Egypt lay open. But Alexander was not only a warrior, he was also a master of psychology and politics. When he met the captured family of Darius, he treated them with dignity and respect, earning admiration even from his enemies. His act contrasted sharply with the usual cruelty of ancient warfare. It showed both magnanimity and calculation by presenting himself as a noble ruler. Alexander strengthened his claim to legitimacy. From Issus, Alexander marched south, taking Phoenician cities one by one. But one city dared defy him: Tyre, a wealthy island fortress off the coast. For 7 months, Alexander besieged Tyre. He built a causeway stretching into the sea, turning the island into a peninsula. His engineers constructed massive siege towers and battering rams. At last, the city fell, and its punishment was terrible. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Alexander had proven again that resistance to him was futile. Next came Egypt. Here, Alexander was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule. He founded a new city on the Nile Delta, Alexandria, which would one day become one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. He also journeyed into the desert to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. The priests hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon, a god of both Greece and Egypt. For Alexander, this was more than flattery. It confirmed his belief that he was chosen by the gods, destined for divine greatness. By the age of 25, Alexander had crossed into Asia, defeated the Persian king in battle, subdued the eastern Mediterranean, and been crowned pharaoh of Egypt. His legend was already immense, but his greatest challenge still lay ahead: the final confrontation with Darius, and the battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. After the triumphs at Issus and Egypt, Alexander had secured his reputation an unstoppable commander. Yet he knew that his conquests were incomplete. As long as Darius III still lived, as long as the Persian heartland remained intact, the dream of total victory remained out of reach. In the spring of 331 BCE, Alexander turned his gaze east. With his army hardened by years of campaigning, he marched once again into Persian territory. His objective was clear: destroy Darius and seize the empire. The journey was arduous. Alexander led his men through Mesopotamia, enduring blazing heat and long marches across barren land. Along the way, he was careful to maintain discipline. Unlike other conquerors, he sought not to ravage the lands he passed through, but to win them. Supplies were taken, but cities that submitted were spared. He understood that lasting rule required more than brute force. As Alexander advanced, Darius prepared for the showdown. The Persian king gathered a massive army, perhaps numbering 200,000 or more, drawn from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Scythians, and even war elephants from distant lands. Darius ordered the plain near the village of Gaugamela to be cleared and leveled, so his chariots could maneuver freely. He intended to use overwhelming numbers and mobility to crush the Macedonian phalanx. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive battles. The Battle of Gaugamela on the morning of October 1st, 331 BCE. Alexander's army stood vastly outnumbered around 47,000 against a force 4 or 5 times its size. Yet morale was high. The Macedonians trusted their king. They knew his brilliance in battle, his ability to read an enemy, and his courage in leading from the front. Darius positioned himself at the center of the Persian line, surrounded by his royal guard. To his flanks were cavalry, chariots with scythe blades fixed to their wheels, and lines upon lines of infantry stretching across the plain. Alexander studied the field carefully. He knew that a head-on assault would be suicidal. Instead, he devised a brilliant maneuver. Placing his phalanx at the center and cavalry on the wings, he advanced at an oblique angle, gradually pulling his right wing outward, as if attempting to flank the Persians. This forced Darius to extend his own line, thinning his forces. At the critical moment, Alexander saw the gap he needed. With his companion cavalry at his side, he wheeled suddenly and charged directly into the Persian center straight at Darius himself. The impact was devastating. The Macedonian wedge cut deep into the Persian lines, spreading chaos. Once again, Darius faltered. Seeing Alexander bearing down upon him, the great king panicked. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, his guards following him. The sight of their king abandoning the fight broke Persian morale. The large portions of the army continued to resist. The heart had been torn out of their cause. The Macedonians pressed the attack. The phalanx advanced steadily, while cavalry on the flanks crushed enemy riders. The scythe chariots that Darius had prepared with such care were rendered useless. Alexander's men simply opened their ranks and let them pass, striking the horses and drivers as they went by. By day's end, tens of thousands of Persians lay dead. Macedonian losses were minimal. Gaugamela was a complete and total victory. Alexander had achieved what his father could only dream of: the defeat of Persia's main army and the flight of its king. The march to Babylon and Persepolis. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire lay open. Alexander marched into Babylon, the great city of Mesopotamia. Unlike at Tyre or Thebes, there was no resistance. Babylon opened its gates, showering Alexander with gifts and honors. He declared himself king of Asia, adopting Persian customs and taking control of the empire's treasury. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, another royal capital, where he seized an even greater prize, enormous wealth, said to amount to 50,000 talents of silver. This treasure gave him the resources to fund further campaigns and reward his troops. Yet Alexander was not content with wealth. He sought symbolic as well as material domination. His next destination was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia and the heart of Achaemenid power. The march to Persepolis was grueling, through harsh mountain passes and fierce resistance. The Persians tried to block him at the Persian gates, a narrow gorge defended by a determined commander named Ariobarzanes. For weeks, the Macedonians struggled to advance. But Alexander, as always, refused to be stopped. He led a detachment through secret mountain paths, outflanking the defenders and crushing them. Ariobarzanes fought to the death, but Persepolis lay open. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he was awed by its grandeur, its palaces, its treasures, its carvings of kings and warriors. The city represented centuries of Persian power and pride. For a time, he spared it. But then came a fateful night. During a drunken banquet, with his men celebrating their victories, Alexander made a decision that would echo through history. Urged on, perhaps by the courtesan Tai, he ordered the great palace of Xerxes to be burned. Flames engulfed the magnificent halls, reducing much of Persepolis to ashes. Some say it was an act of revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece a century earlier, when Xerxes had burned Athens. Others believe it was a reckless mistake, a decision Alexander later regretted. Whatever the truth, the burning of Persepolis symbolized the end of the old Persian order. The pursuit of Darius. Despite these triumphs, Alexander's mission was not yet complete. Darius still lived. Though stripped of power, the Persian king fled east, gathering what forces he could in hopes of continuing resistance. Alexander would not allow it. He pursued Darius relentlessly, through Media and into Parthia. The chase covered hundreds of miles, across rugged terrain and hostile lands. Along the way, Alexander began adopting more Persian customs, wearing royal robes, demanding proskynesis, the ritual act of bowing before the king. Many of his Macedonian companions grumbled, but Alexander was already thinking beyond conquest. He sought to merge Greek and Persian traditions, to present himself not just as a conqueror, but as the rightful ruler of a new, unified empire. At last, in 330 BCE, Alexander's pursuit came to a tragic end. Darius was betrayed by his own satrap, Bessus, who sought to claim power for himself. When Alexander's forces caught up, they found Darius mortally wounded, abandoned in a wagon. According to the sources, Alexander was struck with grief. He covered the body with his own cloak, declared himself Darius' avenger, and gave him a royal burial. By doing so, he positioned himself not merely as the destroyer of Persia, but as the heir to its throne. With Darius dead, the Achaemenid dynasty was finished. Alexander was now the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. But for him, conquest was never enough. His eyes turned further east, toward Bactria, Sogdiana, and the mysterious lands beyond the Hindu Kush. He had become the lord of Asia, but his ambition stretched to the very edges of the known world. After the death of Darius III, Alexander was the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. Yet for the young king of Macedon, conquest itself had become a way of life. He had overthrown dynasties, stormed cities, and claimed crowns, but his ambition burned hotter still. To Alexander, the Persian Empire was not the end, it was the beginning. Into the east, the Bactrian campaign having secured the western provinces, Alexander turned eastward, into the rugged lands of Bactria and Sogdiana region stretching from modern Afghanistan into Central Asia. These were not rich river valleys or grand capitals, but harsh landscapes of mountains, deserts, and fiercely independent tribes. Conquest here would not be decided in a single battle. Instead, it became a war of attrition. The Bactrians and Sogdians fought with ferocity, retreating into mountain fortresses and launching ambushes from the cliffs. Alexander adapted, splitting his forces into smaller units and pursuing his enemies relentlessly. He stormed strongholds thought to be impregnable, scaling cliffs under cover of night, and taking fortresses perched high above the valleys. One fortress, known as the Sogdian Rock, was considered unassailable. Its defenders mocked Alexander, saying he would need men with wings to capture it. In response, Alexander called for volunteers from among his climbers, veterans of the campaign who had scaled walls at Tyre and crossed impossible passes. Using tent pegs as makeshift pitons, they scaled the vertical cliffs at night. When dawn broke, the defenders saw Macedonians standing above them. Their morale shattered. They surrendered without a fight. It was in these campaigns that Alexander met Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian noble. Their marriage was both a personal union and a political strategy, an attempt to fuse Greek and Persian cultures. For his soldiers, however, this union was yet another sign that their king was no longer purely Macedonian. Alexander was becoming something greater and more distant, toward the ends of the earth. By 327 BCE, Alexander had secured his hold over Central Asia, but his gaze was fixed even further east, toward India, land shrouded in mystery, spoken of in Greek tales, a realm of elephants, strange peoples, and endless wealth. To the Macedonian king, India represented not only treasure, but destiny, to march where no Greek had marched, to surpass the deeds of Heracles and Dionysus, to reach the edge of the known world. Crossing the Hindu Kush was a brutal ordeal. The mountains were steep and snow-covered, the passes treacherous, soldiers froze, pack animals perished, and supplies ran low. Yet Alexander pressed forward, driven by vision and ambition. When they finally descended into the Indus Valley, they encountered new peoples and new challenges. Many local rulers submitted peacefully, preferring alliance to destruction. Others resisted, only to be crushed swiftly. One of the fiercest encounters came at the fortress city of Aornos, perched on a steep rock beside the Indus River. Like the Sogdian rock before, it was said to be unconquerable, but Alexander would not be denied. His men built earthen ramps, bridging chasms, hauling siege engines across impossible terrain. After days of struggle, the fortress fell. The Battle of the Hydaspes, the climax of Alexander's Indian campaign, came in 326 BCE, on the banks of the Hydaspes River today, the Jhelum in modern Pakistan. There, he faced King Paris, a powerful ruler with a well-trained army, including a force of war elephants that terrified the Macedonians. The battle began with strategy. The Hydaspes was swollen with monsoon rains, and Paris positioned his army on the far bank, confident that Alexander could not cross without being seen. But Alexander, as always, turned terrain to his advantage. At night, he led part of his army upstream, secretly crossing at a shallow ford. When dawn broke, Paris realized too late that Alexander's forces were already on his side of the river. Battle was joined. Paris's elephants charged, their tusks adorned with blades, trampling men and scattering cavalry. The Macedonian horses panicked at the sight and smell of the beasts. But Alexander's phalanx held firm, using long saurisses to wound the elephants and drive them back. Slowly, the tide turned. Despite fierce resistance, Paris was defeated. Yet when he was brought before Alexander, wounded but proud, the Macedonian king was struck by his dignity. Asked how he wished to be treated, Paris replied, like a king. Alexander admired his courage and restored him to power, making him a trusted ally. The Battle of the Hydaspes was both a triumph and a warning. Though victorious, the Macedonians were exhausted. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and faced new enemies unlike any before. For the first time, Alexander's men began to murmur openly of home. The limits of conquest. Alexander's ambition, however, was boundless. He dreamed of pressing further east, to reach the Ganges and perhaps even the ocean at the edge of the world. But his soldiers had reached their breaking point. At the Hyphasis River modern B's his army mutinied. They refused to march any further. Alexander pleaded with them, spoke of glory, of destiny, of surpassing all mortal limits. Yet the men remained silent. For the first time in his career, Alexander was forced to turn back. Bitter though it was, he concealed his disappointment. Instead, he marked the spot with 12 great altars, dedicating them to the gods, as if to say that even here, at the limits of his empire, he had fulfilled his divine mission. The return journey, the march back west, was no less perilous. Alexander divided his forces, some traveling by river, others across the desert of Gedrosia, modern Baluchistan. The desert march was catastrophic. Blazing heat, lack of water, and endless dunes claimed thousands of lives. Many wondered if their king had led them into ruin. Yet Alexander endured every hardship alongside his men. When water was brought to him in a helmet, he poured it onto the sand, refusing to drink unless all could drink. Such gestures, though small, rekindled loyalty. Still, the army that returned was weary, diminished, and haunted by the cost of conquest. The final years back in Babylon, Alexander set about consolidating his empire. He planned new campaigns against Arabia, perhaps even Rome and Carthage. He reorganized his administration, blending Macedonian and Persian officials. He held mass weddings at Susa, marrying many of his officers to Persian noble women in an effort to unite the two cultures. But cracks were showing. His adoption of Persian customs angered many Macedonians. Plots and conspiracies emerged, and Alexander responded with ruthless executions even against old companions like Cletus, whom he killed in a drunken rage. He was no longer merely a king of Macedon. He had become something greater, more remote, almost divine in his own eyes. In 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. The exact cause remains a mystery. Malaria, typhoid, poison, or exhaustion from years of relentless campaigning. For days, he lay bedridden, his generals anxiously awaiting his recovery. When asked to whom he left his empire, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." On June 10th, Alexander the Great breathed his last. Legacy of a conqueror in barely more than a decade of campaigning, Alexander had forged the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to Egypt, from the Mediterranean to India. His death left it leaderless, soon divided among his generals, the Diadochi, yet his legacy endured. He spread Greek culture across Asia, founding cities, most famously Alexandria, that became centers of learning and trade. His conquests opened new trade routes, mingled peoples, and created a fusion of Greek and Eastern traditions known as Hellenism. In later centuries, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, and even medieval Europeans looked back to Alexander as the model of the universal conqueror, the man who united East and West, and perhaps most enduring of all was the myth, the image of a young king who sought to surpass all limits, who carried Homer's Iliad in his saddlebag, who marched farther than any before him, and who died undefeated. Alexander the Great remains a paradox, both liberator and tyrant, visionary and destroyer, hero and tragedy. His life was short, his empire fleeting, but his name, carved into history, has never been forgotten.